Mina Jun. Thank you. And Muhammad Jun, really, the two of you have my gratitude along with the staff who have helped with this conference. It's such an honor to be with all of you. You're my heroes, truly my heroes, my mentors and my teachers. And it's really an amazing thing to be here with you, my panelists. So I've asked to dim the lights here on stage and to not show us, but to show the images, since this is a talk about photography, so you will probably excuse me for that. And I also ask you, for this one talk at least, to let go of your rational thinking, because it will be helpful. My talk is very much influenced by the work of Stanislav Grof, who works on the psychology of the future, and in particular on a term that he developed called holotropism, which is about a movement towards wholeness. In the larger talk, and I think this is kind of scandalous, the title of my talk is on photography, on Babi and Baha'i photography. The truth is that I decided to cut it down to just one photograph. And that's scandalous, I know, but it's for a particular reason. I want us to focus and do a close reading of this. But in the larger talk, I talk about images not just as photographs, but as conceptual ideas in historiography and in memoirs. And in particular, I focus on the memory of Abu Turab in Nabil's narrative of Tahir's presence in Badasht, and how this image in his memory, this conceptual image in his memory, in his memoir of that moment, has a corresponding image in the Quran and in future depictions of the best of stories, in the Quran, the story of Yusuf in the Quran. I promised that I would show this image, which is a photograph that is attributed as a photograph of Tahir Qurratul Ain to my colleague and dear friend, Farzaneh Milani. Of course, it's not of her, but it is supposed to represent her in some way. Corresponding image that I talk about of the image of Qurratul Ain Tahireh in Badasht, I think is the image of the woman's banquet in the story of Yusuf in the Quran, where the women have been given oranges to peel with a knife. And when Yusuf walks into the room, the women accidentally cut themselves and bleed. Right? And the image that is drawn up in Abu Turab's memoir of Badasht is also about blood. Esfahani cuts himself at the sight of her. We read it as a scandal. He is scandalized by her unveiled appearance. But in fact, what is the correspondence between these two is color, it's blood. And I want to place this talk and these images in the context of photography, where paintings lost their value as representations, as information. And what became important for painting was color. What became the difference between photography and painting was color. So I want to argue, in a sense, that Abu Turab's memory, conceptual image of Badasht was constituted, was produced in the context of photography. And it was animated by blood, by the color of blood, which recalled a previous moment, a mythical moment in the Quran and in the appearance of Yusuf in the association of women, in the banquet of women. And one of the things that's interesting here is that the famous painter Delacroix was never threatened by photography precisely because he was so into color. And I think this is something that we need to remember as we think about the development of photography. Anyway, there's something odd, another scandalous thing about this talk is that photographs are supposed to be about surface representations, about documentation, and all I talk about is interiority. And this is what the crux of what matters, is that the reader of this particular photograph that I want to talk about talks about the state of the interiority, the state of interiority of the subject, which represents anti-disciplinarity on his part, the anti-disciplinarity of the photograph, and also encourages us to read in a new way, in an anti-disciplinary way. Details of structure are, Walter Benjamin writes, more native to the camera than the atmospheric landscapes of soulful portrait. Yet at the same time, photography reveals in its material physiognomic aspects image worlds which dwell in the smallest things, meaningful yet covert enough to find a hiding place in waking dreams. To find a hiding place in waking dreams. So he's talking about photography. But which enlarged and capable of formulation make the difference between technology and magic visible as a thoroughly historical variable. An Iranian chronicle written anonymously by Abdul Baha in the late 1880s and published in English by Edward Granville Brown under the title A Traveler's Narrative articulates a subtle commentary on a disciplining photograph. This commentary traces the peregrinations of a young Persian man from the borders of Europe and the Ottoman Empire to the court of Nasiruddin Shah. It tells us that the young man is bearing a letter written by a nobleman and reformer surnamed Baha'u'llah, who was at the time exiled in Adrianople. The letter that the young man is carrying, the narrator tells us, addresses issues of state and politics and expresses the exiled nobleman's good intentions and loyalty to Nasiruddin Shah. The young man, whose name is given as Mirza Badi, is chosen to deliver the letter to the Shah, who is stationed outside of Tehran. Mirza Badi waits at a distance on a rock outside of the royal pavilion until he's summoned. It is here that the narrative inscribes a precious moment of encounter between Nasiruddin Shah and the emaciated body and enfeebled spirit of the nation's other. Mirza Badi, aware of his ultimate sacrifice, receives permission to approach the royal pavilion with his letter. His dispatch is, according to the narrative, delivered with dignity, composure, and respectfulness surpassing description. The Shah commands to take the letter and arrest the bearer in order to deliberate on matters raised in the letter. And shocked at this gesture of almost uncritical acceptance, others in Shah's company are said to have reacted with reprehension. As a result, the young Mirza Badi is ordered by the Shah's ministers to suffer punishment and torture for his presumptuous approach to the royal court. And the spectacle of his mutilated body is to be made into a disciplinary measure, like so many others under Nasiruddin Shah's rule, ostensibly for the edification of the masses. A traveler's narrative reports the following. At first, they torment At the first torment they applied the chain and rack, saying, Make known thy other friends that thou mayest be delivered from excruciating punishment, and make thy comrades captive, that thou mayest escape the torment of the chain and the keenness of the sword. But torture, brand, and torment him as they might, they saw naught but steadfastness and silence, and found naught but dumb endurance on his part. So, when the torture gave no result, they first photographed him, the executioners on his left and on his right, and he sitting bound in fetters and chains beneath the sword with perfect meekness and composure, and then slew and destroyed him. The anonymous author of the narrative then writes that he sent for the photograph. Abdul Baha sent for the photograph and found it worthy, he says, worthy of contemplation. For Mirza Badi is seated with wonderful humility and strange submissiveness in utmost resignation. This photograph, like many that came before it, was an encounter of the nation with the image of itself, that unlike the mirror did not take its word back. With the coming of photography, our knowledge of everyday life, of the quotidian, was made possible. Through these methods, writes Walter Benjamin, one first learns of the optical unconscious, just as one learns of the drives through psychoanalysis. It is this link between the quotidian details recovered by the momentary click of the camera and the psychoanalytic recovery of the unconscious that is key to what I say is our understanding of the anti-disciplinarity of the Badi photograph and of the anti-disciplinarity of Abdu'l-Baha's commentary on it. In historical records, commentaries on specific photographs dating to the late 19th century show that the camera in Iran, itself immersed in the realm of the haram, unveils and communicates a set of core meanings which cut through surface representations and speak about the interior or botany character of the photograph subjects to their receivers. Photographic representations recover an excess of meaning, a piercing otherness, one could say, hidden beyond the scope of the visible. Etemad Saltaneh records an illustrative example of this recovered otherness in his diary. He writes, the court photographer, meaning Nasiruddin Shah's photographer, was ordered by Nasiruddin Shah to take a picture of His Excellency Haji Mullah Hadi. And because until then His Excellency the Haji had not witnessed the action of photography or considered it, and considered it against the laws and scientific proofs of the sages, he was infinitely surprised. We could speculate that this was due to the fact that the ancients believed in the philosophers of old that argued that shadows which had no materiality could only gain permanence and be transported through bodies and not things. So he didn't believe that photographs could possibly capture a human because only humans capture things. Just as there is no material thing without a shadow, the shadow cannot exist without the presence of the body that it shadows. Thus it was argued that only human form was capable of imprinting recordings and recording fleeting images, not paper or glass. The faculties of inscription and memory were, in other words, beyond the scope of man-made machines, and upon seeing his own image, the Haji was shocked and agreed that scientific knowledge, meaning photography, had conquered the rhapsodies of the philosophers of old. Immersed in the realm of the unpresentable in Iran, photography ironically revealed a realm of interiority untouched by ruling representational language. This hidden otherness revealed itself in a future moment, as if it were secreted away in the folds of clothing, in shadows of objects, and in poses adopted in portraiture. It disclosed itself, so we have to go searching for it, not only in the contents that are obvious, but also in the form of the photographically visual, in the processes of recording and imprinting. So let me return to the photograph of Mirza Badi in the Traveler's Narrative and the commentary attached to it. In this commentary, Abdu'l-Baha states that he acquired the photograph after the execution of Mirza Badi. He says he was seated in the center with executioners on his right and left, and you see that it's there. We should note in passing that similar photographs of criminals emerged and were circulated in Iran as a means to warn, discipline, and instill fear in the Shah's subjects under the reign of the Qajars. Yet this commentary insists. This commentary around the photographic encounter emphasizes the inefficiency of the royal disciplinary gesture of circulating, disciplining photographs. The inefficiency. The narrator rests his eyes on the photograph in order to contemplate the heroism and integrity of the sword's victim. It goes completely to the other side of what the photograph is meant to do, to the other extreme, to contemplate the heroism and the integrity of the sword's victim, rather than embracing the state-imposed language of the law. Abdu'l-Baha's commentary issues a challenge to it and to those who attempt to pose the subject of the photograph in terms that are destructive of the common good. The commentary similarly challenges the claims to the surface and superficial level documentation of reality to which photography is assigned during this time. Right? It challenges those claims to documentation. And hence truth that underwrite both the disciplining measures adopted by the Shah through photography and the tradition of distance and objectivity in foreign travelers' narratives and textual accounts and photographic documents in the 19th century, a tradition in Iranian culture to which a traveler's narrative's own labors admittedly rest and lean on. As such, the commentary configures a critique that derives its force from the reading of a photograph as an anti-disciplinary object. Does not fit within disciplining and disciplinary categories. An object that not only shows where we need to go, but also thinks its future evolutions and its fields of future influence from within. The commentary challenges the disciplinary measures ascribed to the photograph by the royal court. It also undercuts the tradition of scientific objectivity attributed to photography, especially in the disciplining discourses of its contemporaries. But, and this is what is really interesting, the photograph itself embraces another irony on the level of its content. The photograph, not the commentary. With fetters around his neck and feet, the young man rests his left hand on the chain. Not unlike the first photograph of Nasiruddin Shah taken by his own camera in front of the port, the victim, Mirza Badi, stares directly at the lens. What is remarkable, however, is not the gaze, but the subject's hand. Mirza Badi's hand placement in this photograph is reminiscent of a time in early Western traditions of photography when it was necessary to give models support so that they would remain steady and still for the duration of the exposure in photo ateliers. You recall that he's not in a photo atelier. Models stood with their fingers braced in their jacket buttons to hold still. In these early photographs, columns appeared next to drapes and awkwardly standing on rugs. And these pillars were the emblems of a well-rounded education. Framing the photographs of the servants of the interior court in Iran during the time of Muzaffaruddin Shah, and also during the time of Nasiruddin Shah, foreign settings produced by studio mats attested to a universal perception. Photography was seen as an opportunity to not only go elsewhere, but to become other. Photography was not necessarily a means by which one could capture the spirit or the ghost of the subject of portraiture, as some had thought. It was rather a means by which one could create other histories, other selves, to become other. In this movement towards otherness, we see also a holotropism, a movement towards embracing the other, a bringing about wholeness. As Stanislav Grof has coined holotropism in the psychology of the future, it's an internal journey that moves to incorporate all that is, past and future, seen and unseen, into itself, and in a gesture that consigns photography to the opportunity to live spectrally, servants and eunuchs put on costumes, strange straw hats in the inner court of Nasir-ed-Din Shah and Muzaffar-ed-Din Shah. In these photographs, these servants of the interior embraced their otherness. Courtiers made themselves look like women, like hedgehogs and flower pots. They articulate in this, okay, I'm going to go back because this is going to confuse you. They articulate in the transformation they effect through new technology what the old forms retrieved by Abu Turab in Nabil's narrative, in his recollection of the events of Badash, could only begin to surmise. They incorporate other times, other beings, other spaces, other genders, other selves, into themselves, within themselves, now. Mirza Badi's hand gesture, semiotically read as a sign of humility in Iranian culture, awkwardly replicates Western traditions of photography. And one wonders if this gesture of the hand, like Nasir-ed-Din Shah's top hat and imported chairs in his own court photographs, was not inherited from the early Western elements of photographic portraiture, a gesture shaped in the context of modern Western technological development and remembered and mimicked even to the last moment of his life. In an uncanny current of antagonistic articulation, and thus linked to the veiled condition of interiority, the batin, Mirza Badi's photograph externalizes a gesture with its connotation of interior integrity to the visual and exterior and superficial realm of the zahir, of the scene. It does so through the exposure of the abject Iranian subject to technological advances in photography. The young Babi's hand gesture is a photographic index, buried for decades, and directing the vision of us, its readers, looking back. It instructs us, its viewers, in an anti-disciplinary practice. This is why I asked you to maybe let go a little bit of your rationalism and open your eyes. It is through the specificity of this reading practice that Abdu'l-Baha also articulates a critique of state. It is through this anti-disciplinary practice that Abdu'l-Baha also articulates a critique of state in his reading of this photograph. I suggest that it was, in fact, against the Babi image, an image of the self that also cast itself as the embodiment of the nation's other, that modern Iran could emerge as whole. The historical context of photography made this holotropism, this movement towards wholeness, visually sayable. The development of the Babi image and its after-images stand as the dialectical image of the modern Iranian self. For in such a picture, Walter Benjamin once eloquently wrote, the spark has, as it were, burned through the person in the picture with reality, finding the indiscernible place in the condition of the long past minute, where the future nests, where the future is nesting, even today, so eloquently that we, looking back, can discover it. Thank you.
Thank you, Motahhedeh.